So this is Thursday at the end of January 2025, and I am going to be speaking with a reporter, Brandon Croydon from the BBC. And he wants to hear something about Free Black Thought, my role in it, and our collective position on DEI and what it means for DEI programs to be eviscerated. Where to begin? Where to begin? I'll try to keep this short, but it won't be as concise as if I wrote this down. But I want to have this so I can talk about it and write it down. So I'm Michael David Cobb Bowen. I was born in Oceanside, California, and my favorite musical group is Thelonious Monk. I like solo piano, which I can't really play. I don't have any talent, but I like that I can play certain chords from certain songs to a certain amount. I'm married 30 years, 3 adult children. I grew up in Los Angeles. I've worked all over the United States and abroad. I'm a data engineer. I began programming computers before Star Wars. So I'm an old head in the technical IT business, computer science. The last time I checked, I have an IQ of 132. And when I was in 3rd grade, in a dispute I had against my 3rd grade teacher, I took my first IQ test and I scored 132. And they didn't believe it, so I took the test again. I scored 136. But I've mostly said 132. And I just read an article by a friend of mine, a Harvard law professor, or a law professor with a degree from Harvard Law, who thinks about gifted people. And I'm pretty sure that I'm gifted because I listen to my own mind a lot. And anyway, I'm a co-founder and board member for the Foundation for Free Black Thought. I'm now serving as the treasurer. And we're going into our 4th fiscal year. Free Black Thought is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization dedicated to the proposition that Black Americans, particularly, but not exclusively, are individuals, and that 50 million of us don't think alike, behave alike, and racial unity is a farce, and we are all skeptical about the use of race, how it is constructed, how it is deconstructed, how it is substituted for culture, etc., etc. And so we provide a number of publications on Substack, on Twitter, on podcasts that highlight Black viewpoint diversity. And we're pretty successful in getting that message across. We have become something of a samizdat for divergent Black ideas and heterodox thinking. I am most definitely a heterodox thinker. I tend to be an explorer, an adventurer, a pioneer. I go there. Let's go. So what is DEI? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is that it's wrong for first principles and it's wrong from practical standpoint. Let's start with inclusion. Inclusion was done by the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. So they were done over 50 years ago. And they were done correctly. And although there have been a lot of Supreme Court level decisions about affirmative action, Griggs, Adarand, Bakke, University of Michigan, that is all on the margins of the basic 14th Amendment that says we're all full citizens. I'm currently interested in looking at whichever one of those decisions said disparate impact is a de facto racist discrimination, because I am. I have an argument that I believe to be true, and I believe that very few of our civil rights excuse me, cases in law are looking at supply and demand for disparate impact. So one of the things that I did in the mid 80s, when I was an intern at the Xerox Corporation in El Segundo, California, is I was responsible for writing the program which was aligned with the GS compensation scale for the Army, the military, the federal government, in the manpower planning system at the Xerox Corporation. So those of you who are familiar with employment law, labor law, know that there are exempt employees and non-exempt employees. And exempt employees would be the white-collar ones who are on salary, and non-exempt would be the hourly employees. And the exemption has to do with, do you get time and a half for overtime? That's the major part of it. So if you can imagine a three-tiered scale of employees, you have the non-exempt, and then you have the exempt, but within exempt you have executives and you have the GS scale. So if an entry-level person, you come in at GS 1 or 2, and you have a range of salaries that you can get. And in a manpower planning system, you are given an annual evaluation on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being outstanding in your job performance. If over the course of 2 years or 3 years, depending on how well the company's doing, you merit a 3.5, which is kind of like a GPA, but it's a little bit better than GPA. It's a little bit more fine-grained. Then you are promotable, which means you can be promoted to the next GS level. If you started as a GS2, you could be promoted to GS3. And there's going to be a band of salaries along that line to which you are promotable depending on the profitability of the company. So a company that annually grows at 2%, 3%, you can generally expect a 2% or 3% raise as you get out of one grade band to the next grade band. So within the 3 sections, we focused on the GS 12. And it might have been 15, I don't recall. And this was called Balanced Workforce. And the Balanced Workforce plan was to identify by sex and race, but basically 4 categories: majority male, majority female, minority female. And that's as far as we went. And this won the award by the Business Roundtable, which, I don't know, CEOs around the country had this thing called the Business Roundtable. And Vernon Jordan, who was probably one of the most brilliant Black Americans of his era, was part of the Business Roundtable. And also, well, I don't know who else was on it, but we certainly won that award, and I was certainly the guy who had the numbers and monitored those numbers for our group within Xerox. So what's the affirmative action part? The affirmative action part was to use the balanced workforce model to determine what percentage of minority males as compared to, let's say, majority males, or across the four groups, two of which were called, or three of which were called, I'm not sure actually, protected classes. Okay, so these protected classes would be the ones that were sensitive to their promotions, their demotions, and their percent representation. Now, the reason why this was essentially fair was because it looked at the people within the organization on the same basis as everybody else in the organization, to look at their fitness reports, to look at their fitness reports, their evaluations on an annual basis, to see if they're doing above average. And basically they said, look, if you get a 3.5, you are promotable. So we would look at, for each GS band, who was promotable by protected class. So let's say that there's 500 employees, and they split, let's say, 300 majority male, 200, no, I said 500. So 300 majority male, 100 minority male, that gives us 400, and let's say 50 each of minority male, minority female, and majority female. Okay, and let's say this is the engineering division, because we do it by all the departments as well. So your total representation is 150 minorities altogether out of 500. So that's 30%. That's pretty high. But whatever. The question is, what percentage of that 30% of the total population is promotable? And you could say there is something imbalanced. Now, we're not necessarily saying there's discrimination, we're just saying there's an imbalance. So if we say 70% of the 150 minority are promotable and 50% of the majority are promotable, then you should expect that by objective means, the minority group will get promoted more often than the majority group. And basically this says, even by group, because the groups consist of individuals, and who knows, I mean, you have to be promotable, right? That, we can plan, because this is a manpower planning system, that within X number of years, then these balances will work their way out. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with where you are in the country. It has absolutely nothing to do with demand. It has to do with the performance of the population that's already employed. All right? So if you have a low percentage of minorities within your organization, then outreach is a separate kind of thing. So the question is, and if you're a computer scientist, you think of the boundary conditions. What are the boundary conditions? So you can market, you can buy billboard spaces, you can buy radio spots, you can buy television advertisements, you can do job fairs. There's all kinds of community relations and marketing that you can do to promote the fact that your company has X number of jobs and you're hiring, okay? And you could put whatever flavor of character poster boys that you want on your billboards and in your radio spots. And I think the U.S. Army did a great job back in their days where they had a first sergeant who was black and who was drinking coffee on the TV. And they said, "Good morning, First Sergeant." And you remember that. And it was a guy who looked like Ray Parker Jr., handsome devil. So I've just described an affirmative action program called Balanced Workforce that takes a program of promotions that everybody in the entire company is subject to see whether or not they're performing. And there are other assumptions. There's kind of a Peter principle. You could see that somebody at a GS5 has not been promoted in 6 years because they're at a 3.0 or 2.9, or some people have been demoted, blah 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 blah. There's every consideration for individual performance within the organization to promote who's promotable. But everybody's equally subject to these annual evaluations. Okay? So but that has nothing, that's completely disjoint by supply and demand of minorities in, let's say, engineering, in the community from which the labor pool is drawn. So this is inclusion. This is inclusion, and it is a monitoring of the mix. Are we getting a mix? Now, you could make this thing a great deal more complicated, and by some reasons, there are reasons. You look at disabilities, and people are required to report the disabilities of certain people, or the veteran status, and then the sex. And for some of these, you can decline to state, which is the current state of EEO. But the question is DEI outreach? And is DEI... So basically I'm saying, inclusion, I've seen it. I know that it happens. I know personally community officers, outreach officers in HR for very large corporations. For a very large corporation. And I know the culture of that corporation as compared to the corporate culture of others. And that's owing to, my experience across the country in all the major cities of working as a consultant in IT, in business intelligence. And I can tell you from my experience, executive teams pay a great deal more attention to financial performance than they do to HR mixes. And they are looking at a lot more key performance indicators that are valuable to shareholders and investors than they are to diversity initiatives. So that was a simple model. It certainly scales to every gender that you can count, presuming that people keep the same gender through their career, because if one year they're batting for the boys team and the next year they're batting for the girls team, that's going to skew the results. But those things could be discounted as well. And depending on how many, if you want to do this by sexual preference, you could do that too. If you want to do this by diversity, let's talk about diversity. So inclusion is basically, it's basically illegal to discriminate in hiring. And if you're going to discriminate in promotion or demotion, then you have to have a manpower planning that everybody goes through. You can't just look at one black person and say, I was unfairly treated, if you don't have a system that keeps track of how everybody is treated. All right. So hard to say if in the 5 years that we've suffered through DEI, people are actually doing that. But let's presume that is. I say EEO is inclusion, and it's fair enough. Now let's look at diversity. Diversity is squishy. And by diversity, what do you mean? Do you mean progressive diversity? Let's call it progressive diversity because progressive diversity are the standard dimensions and attributes by which you block and categorize people. Okay? So immediately this is a leftist idea which inherits from leftist ideology that says what we want to track is not majority male versus minority male versus majority female. That's not specific enough. We want gender preference. We want a spectrum of sexual preference. And we want this. We are motivated because we believe that there is oppression and oppressors. And we have done that, excuse me, through the lens of white privilege, and we've done that through the lens of homophobia, and we've done that through the lens of trans activism, and we are going to have white privilege or privileged people, i.e. oppressors, versus people of color. Okay, so that means if you're Hispanic, which basically means you speak Spanish, or Spanish is speaking at home, whether or not it is the primary or secondary language, which is a distinction I don't think most people make, although we could certainly throw that into a balanced workforce model. And then we could look at immigration status. We could look at any number of things that fit into this oppressor versus oppressed power dynamic. Now, those are the progressive dimensions because they carry moral weight in politics rather than just broad demographic kind of things. For example, well, I don't know. It's interesting because I think it's clear that we have politicized plus sizes in fashion. And I would say, who cares about what dress size you are? But we literally went through a time where stores like Target were saying, we are going to price all of our bathing suits the same, no matter what size you are. Now, I seriously doubt that took much of a sacrifice, but at some point somebody identified that and said, "Oh, let's fix that." But there was certainly a plus size women category that a phase that we went through for marketing that, and I think that was progressive. I think that was a progressive political ideology behind that. And again, this is a kind of moral thing. So when we talk about diversity, what kind of diversity do we mean? Now, I've heard a lot of arguments, but I basically think these are always boiling down to the progressive dimensions. Nobody cares about diversity of blood type. Nobody cares about diversity of hometown. Nobody cares about diversity of musical taste. Nobody really cares about diversity of education. Nobody ever says, we have too many Ivy Leaguers in this bank, so we need to diversify. and we are going to stop accepting applications from Ivy Leaguers if they get over 12% of our population. Now, what percent of Ivy League, excuse me, students are above, let's say, GS 12 and moving into the executive ranks? Well, if that is overrepresented, do we do anything about that? Probably not. But let's presume that we meant ideological diversity. So we would say red or blue, left or right, Democrat or Republican, or independent or libertarian, or green. Then that would be something that would be put into your DEI system. I don't think that would be fair, but I think it would be honest. Because the squishy nature of diversity is that it means different things to different people. Pretty much everybody understands Asian as a racial category. Pretty much everybody understands white as a racial category. But if I say neurodiversity, or if I say intellectual diversity, what does that mean? How do you measure it? How do you test for that? Nobody does. You guess. So when we say diversity is our strength, what exactly is the diversity that you're talking about? If your job is to make O-rings for the space shuttle, would you want to have a diversity of physicists on there? Yes. You would like to have different physics people who understand the same thing. But you don't want to put in scuba divers, necessarily. I don't have a stock remedy for that, but I did see a commercial for Indeed, I think, a job site where these people are interviewing, and one person is the interviewer, turns out to be a jazz dance major, and the interviewee lists a bunch of majors that were irrelevant. You know, our standard joke is underwater basket weaving is what we always talked about. But let's say you're in marketing, or you're in communications, or you're in HR. You can certainly expect that a lot of different liberal arts majors would fit into those categories, depending on what the marketing budget is. I mean, marketing is no joke. It's not easy to do. And I don't mean to suggest any of those are easy to do, but I think with a certain amount of well-read, literate capability, I mean, you can read and write and edit and clean up communications. That's a significant skill. And leave it at that. The question is, are you tracking the degrees that these people were hired into? And is that part of your question of promotion and demotion and transfers within the labor pool of your organization? So what I basically believe is people say diversity, and diversity is squishy enough so that they can mean racial diversity if they want to. All right? Which is, why do you need that and inclusion? What's the difference? What's the point? It makes it a little bit more palatable to say we're associating diversity and inclusion without being specific about what kind of diversity you mean. And I presented a slideshow earlier this year, or last year, sorry, where we showed pictures, as you can imagine, the typical kinds of happy pictures that you see on college undergraduate brochures or annual reports for corporations, where you have a bunch of smiling people in different costumes. All right, and I found one actually with a young Asian man on crutches. And I said, I don't think I've seen that kind of diversity before. But yeah, they had a smiling woman in a wheelchair, and they had a woman who was wearing hijab. And so I went through 3 or 4 of these slides where you see these diverse connotations of diversity, right? Very, very few of them. I don't know if they had one with like older people older than 60. At any rate, diversity means many things to many people. It could be standardized, but generally it's standardized for moral suasion, and that is the ideology of the progressive left. It's identity politics, and I don't think it belongs in a meritocracy. And again, keep in mind that manpower planning is something that helps you know whether you are promoting the right people. You have to have succession planning. What happens if the executive is hit by a truck? You have to have somebody to fill those shoes, because nobody is indispensable. And the point of having an institution is making sure that standards and protocols are in place so that you know your job, you know your boss's job, you know your department's function, and you know whether or not you're doing it right. And you are evaluated by that. Okay? And that's what makes the organization competitive with other organizations elsewhere. If you are in the oil and gas business, you need to understand what it means. So let's recap. Outside of your internal manpower planning, when you're looking at promotions and demotions and transfers by protected class, how do you define those classes? Are you abiding by the equal opportunity law for inclusion? Because just because you're inclusive doesn't mean you're doing affirmative action. It's saying that you are not discriminating. You are not discriminating. You're taking all applicants and you're not throwing them away by saying, okay, let's see if there's women who applied for this job. We are not going to hire a woman. Okay, so you throw away all those where they indicate that thing so they can discriminate on that basis. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that we're not doing anything like they do in music. We are not doing blind applications. We are not doing double blind applications. All right. So, as an aside, one of the things that we've heard is that if your name is Shaquitha or Lavandre or something like that, I'm pulling these out of thin air because I don't know. I only know Devontae because I watch football, and I know that there's at least 1 or 2 Devontaes in the NFL, and I have never known a Devontae in my life. I've known a Darrell, I've known a Wanda Faye, I've known a Vertus, I've known a, what was his name? I said Woodrow. There's not very many Woodrows out there. Woodrow sounds like a black man's name to me, but who knows? But I think it was the Freakonomics guys, Dubner et al., who said that ethnic-sounding names are often disregarded in the HR process. Well, it's easy enough for you to blank out the names and go blind. So why don't you? Same thing with race. Same thing with gender. Same thing with sex. You're prohibited from asking about religion on the U.S. Census. I don't think I've ever filled out a job application where they ask my religion. And that certainly makes a difference. I know on my tax forms, I say whether or not I'm married, but I never do that on a job application form. So this is not arbitrary and random. Those things make a difference in your capability of spending overtime. You know, if you have young children that you have to attend to, you know, we all put that under work-life balance. Some people mean I can't go rollerblading at 5 o'clock. So when my rollerblading gang gets together, you know, we go around the Central Park Lake. But more seriously, diversity is squishy because we can imply intellectual diversity, which but most of the time we mean racial diversity, and worse still, we mean intellectual diversity, meaning we associate this race with a certain intellectual capacity, and we want to make sure they get in. So we want racial representation, sometimes at the expense of intellectual capacity, and that cuts both ways, as the decision of Students versus Harvard shows, which is similar to how it went before with regard to Jews at Harvard and in the Ivy League. So inclusion is fine because it doesn't necessarily mean affirmative action. Affirmative action is fine as long as everybody has the same standardized tests within the organization. Diversity is squishy because nobody really means anything other than racial diversity. So we're playing that game. Now we get to equity. And equity is the poison pill. We can tolerate inclusion, we can tolerate diversity, given the right protocols. But equity basically means we're doing a handicap. We are handicapping, we are treating a protected class, not simply for monitoring it, but we are going to move our investments towards that. And the question is, how do we measure that against disparate impact? Again, I bring that up because the legal standard for that term, disparate impact, means, as the law stands today, any variation from the general population to the representation in your organization, considering that it's large enough, I think 250 employees or 50 employees, whatever the small business limit is a de facto discrimination. All right. Now, that would be a wonderful thing if I were racially self-interested and I would say, how many black software engineers are there at the major companies, at Google, at Microsoft? And I've worked in this business for 30 years, and it is very rare that I see professionals, black professionals, in leadership roles. It suits me okay. I mean, there were moments in my career when I thought about moving over into sales, and certainly the compensation is better in sales than for engineering, for enterprise software. But I had young children, and I could not afford to have a bad year in sales. So that was out of the question for me. But I can also tell you that I don't think I've ever met, in all of these years, a killer sales guy who was Asian. I have met a few women who nail it, who crush it, but most of the hunters and rainmakers I have known are particular kind of Glengarry, Glen Ross white men. And it's not it's well, genius arrives where it arrives. I've met one black guy that I know who kicked butt as a sales rep, and in fact, he was bored by knocking out his quota. He was a Denver Broncos fan back when the Broncos were world champs, and he ended up doing very well in another phase of life. My point is simply this: representation against a racial number is arbitrary. I am what I am and who I am because I decided to make what I wanted of my life. And I had the right connections at the right time or whatever. I can't account for all of it, but it's about my interest. And I followed my interest. And I disciplined myself and I was ready to compete. And I did compete. And I competed and won. Now I know there is a tendency for people to say, well, you stood on the shoulders of other people. And, I discount those arguments. I don't necessarily dismiss them. But the point is, equity is a poison pill. It is anti-competitive. It is anti-meritocratic. It is arbitrary based on politicized, moral, pro-social definitions, and it is inaccurate. It doesn't judge properly on an equal basis, and it also doesn't respect the choices that people make. In my neighborhood, for example, when I grew up, there were cops and robbers. There were good kids and there were bad kids. We didn't have gang members, but we had kids who didn't think anything was wrong with shoplifting. And when the crack wars came around, there were kids who had no compunction against selling drugs. And when I went back to my neighborhood some 30 years later, I found out a lot of kids that I grew up with were either in the military or mechanics or in jail. And so there were cops and robbers in the military or cops or mechanics or in jail. That was largely it for the guys in my neighborhood. And there were some who managed to, survive just in blue-collar jobs. But my neighborhood produced those kinds of people. And, we all had the same values or were in the same environment growing up. And I can't tell you how typical that would be. I could just tell you what I know about my zip code. And the point is, I look at the supply. And if the demand does not meet the supply, then you have an imbalance. But who's saying comprehensively what black people want to do? You can't determine that by race. If you're going to means test, then means test. But I don't know where those numbers are. I certainly wasn't provided them for the manpower planning system. I could look at the outreach in the local school district and say, hey, who here wants to go into STEM? Back before there was STEM. And I could tell you, by and large here in California, that K-12 is not doing well in the public school system. They're not producing even grade level performance in the public schools. So how are we going to get to diversity or equity in the demanding fields? And here's the, it's not ironic, it follows from the logic of a misguided pro-social agenda. If, let's say, the University of California, which are generally research institutions, wants to maintain a diversity quota, are they going to do race norming on standardized tests? Are they going to eliminate standardized tests? Are they going to make the emphasis different by class? So what are the boundary conditions, and how can we evaluate them objectively? How do you meet that? If the Asian population in California is 9%, and the freshman class for the University of California is, let's say, 12% Asian, what accounts for that differential? Is it a different standard of admission for Asians? Are they competing on a fair basis with everybody else? And I don't think anybody has objective numbers for that so that they would be forthcoming. But again, the very basic idea of racial essentialism is what we're combating here. And that plays into diversity, it plays into inclusion, and equity means we're going to put our finger on the scale. If this person has been running a 10-second 100-meter dash and the competition, generally speaking, is running 9.5, then we're going to give him a 5-yard or 5-meter head start. That doesn't work. That is not fair. And if students have a matriculation rate of X at a class of universities which are still trying to meet the general population distribution of a demographic, and they have, X minus 20% at a higher level institution, or X plus 20% at a lower level institution, then how do we know that that is a proper distribution of the people? We look at, for example, undergraduate majors. And Musa Al-Gharbi has looked at this, put this chart in his book, and demonstrates that in anthropology, there are no right ideologies. There's no red people in anthropology. It's all blue. So I'm going to use one word that's been used well by Jonathan Haidt, and that is disconfirmation. And so when I think of heterodox ideology or heterodoxy in general, I think different professions and different kinds of institutions need different kinds of ideological diversity. And not just ideological diversity, but heterodoxy, meaning you need some people to play devil's advocate all the time. Because, in fact, that is how knowledge makes progress. You need disconfirmation. You need to combat a stodgy bias. And you need to combat confirmation bias. And you need to combat um, a kind of intellectual stodginess that does not allow for change. And in certain arenas, you need to combat individualism. In certain functions, depending on what the goal is, you want uniformity, because uniformity gets one to an abstract goal that's not necessarily natural. Um, so, for example, there's a reason that armies use uniforms. There's a reason why um, the work of an exempt employee is different from the work of a non-exempt employee. And there's a reason why blue-collar values are different than white-collar values. And some organizations need a mix. Some organizations need some exclusivity. If you are running a closed shop for a union, because the union has developed work rules over the decades that include safety, prohibitions against child labor, you don't say, well, we need diversity in our safety protocols, or we need diversity in our child labor laws. No, you don't. You need uniformity. You need conformity. You need people to toe that line, and you're not saying, okay, you're not pulling people out of Beverly Hills and saying, we don't have enough white male sewing machine operators in the clothing industry. Why is that? Well, you have to, again, look at supply and demand, and you have to look at internal promotion, demotion, transfers, and do manpower planning. And so this is not simple. This is not easy. This requires discipline. It requires thought. It requires transparency. And it requires fairness. And I think the regimes that have sprung into place, all calling themselves the same thing, DEI, have had a diversity of implementations, many of which have run afoul of common sense as well as accountability. And I'm not suggesting that this can be wiped clean with the stroke of a pen. But I think when it is challenged at the level that it has been challenged, that people are going to have to justify it on other than squishy pro-social rationales. There are lots of reasons why people can believe a policy causes harm. Again, we have to look at both sides of the equation on disparate impact. All right? There is no racial epithet you could possibly throw at me that's going to disturb my zen, my calm. There's a great scene at the beginning of the movie Deep Cover, in which a police captain calls in various black applicants and asks them a very specific question. And all three of them have different responses. And the best response got Larry Fishburne the job. And I think it's a perfect example of what we talk about when we talk harm. And we cannot, for the sake of a presumable pro-social good, eliminate competition or stack competition, put our fingers on the scale of competition, because anything else will create ghettos. It will create bubbles. It will create double standards. And that is the primary reason to oppose DEI. It's the primary reason to oppose ESG, where externally generated ideas and metrics impose themselves very rapidly on an institution that's trying to do what it can to establish some uniformity in places where it needs uniformity in protocol, and establish disconfirmation where it is stodgy and group thinky. And it is not ironic at all that people who are absolutely positively ready to unfriend people they've known for years over the ideological point of the existence of DEI programs is obvious. And I think it's also obvious the kind of racial epithets that a heterodox black thinker would receive for championing the divestiture of DEI. So, again, from the perspective of someone who is on the board of the Foundation for Free Black Thought, when I am a champion of black viewpoint and intellectual diversity, I'm fighting for or advocating for Americans to understand that black Americans are individuals. It's really just that simple. That's what it boils down to. We come from different backgrounds, from different regions. We have different interests. We have different strengths. We have different weaknesses. We have different histories. And nobody can speak for all of us. Nobody can speak for a number of groups of us. And as I always say, Amazon, which is a company that's less than 30 years old, never asked me my race. It wants my home address, it wants my credit card, and it wants my email. And it doesn't ask any affirmative action questions. And I get exactly what I want from it. And nobody but Amazon could go and tell, if there's some disparate impact going on at Amazon. So I know that we are capable of operating in a raceless environment like Amazon. Amazon did not exist during Jim Crow. It never had to be reformed. And you have to ask yourself, in the existence of all of these, which of these companies actually need to be reformed? Tiger Woods, for example, grew up in here in Southern California. There was never slavery in Southern California. So was the lack of slavery the thing that made him excellent in the world of golf, which is not a traditional African American specialty? Well, no. As soon as you start talking about golf, then you learn about African Americans who have excelled in that endeavor. But also, there's no legacy of slavery in Cerritos, California. It's a nice place. I actually thought very seriously about moving my family there, but I chose Redondo Beach. At any rate, at the larger scale, it is most Americans' inability to think their way out of racial identity that fuels the kind of dysfunctions that DEI is inevitably going to produce. There is this idea that we have to mind racial identity because the presumption is that America is a racist country and that black Americans achieve and other ethnics achieve despite what America is. And that presumption is just wrong. And things that follow logically from that presumption are going to be erroneous. They're going to get us in trouble. They're going to make huge mistakes. Now, nobody knows enough to say where the dissonance is and where the direct action is taking place. Again, we don't know if it's supply and demand. We don't know if it's enemy action in every regard. And I can be certain that somebody, somewhere, some number of people, some fraction of the protected classes absolutely did benefit from DEI. But can we say that's better than luck? Can we say that's better than the regime that we had 10 years ago? No. It's going to take a while to figure all that out. But the long arc of history, or at least the past 50 years, in 1960 there were 20 million Negroes, and they were largely poor. I mean, you could just randomly guess, oh, here's a Negro, it's 1960, you're living poorly, aren't you? And yeah, that was a pretty good guess. You couldn't say that in the year 2000. In the year 2000, there were 36 million, and they were largely middle class. And so more were graduating from predominantly white colleges than historically black colleges. So that's real integration, and that's the real result of the real ambition of real people who really worked and made the system work for them. And of course, I'm one of those, and my family benefits from that. And I see it, and again, in the people I befriend. And black people only know the black people that they know. So I'm a single data point, but I'm a data point with integrity. I'm a data point that has thought through this kind of thing so much that other people could benefit from what I've learned. And that's why I continue my work with the Foundation for Free Black Thought. And I'm cool. And I think Panonica is one of the most beautiful songs ever written by Thelonious Monk. I don't think it was about a black woman. And why should it be? There's enough beauty in the world for us all to recognize it for what it is. And we don't have to be pigeonholed and swim laned and categorized and pinned to a display in a museum. We need freedom to compete, to choose, to go where we please. And non-discrimination is the best way forward, not equity, not putting our finger on the scale and trying to come out with equal outcomes. And again, we should remember that disparate impact goes both ways. There are ways to game the system to get ahead using race, and that certainly happened in these in these regimes. But in the end, I think when we stop trying to establish racial unity, when we abandon the utility of these labels and we think about what our material causality for success and failure in institutions in America, we get close to fulfilling, the scientific discipline and free inquiry that allows us to make objective progress, rather than what a certain elite class of people adopt as their ethics, their pro-social ethics. We are certainly subject to a class of billionaires who I don't know. I don't want to get into that. I don't blame billionaires, but I have an archetypical person in mind, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, who gives tens of millions of dollars to nonprofit organizations, unlike the Foundation for Free Black Thought, who serve the interests of an ideologically driven set of goals and ambitions, rather than one that uses objective measures that are fair and applied to everyone in terms of their merit, their ability, their achievements, and their competitive strengths. And that's what the country needs. We don't need elites setting the agenda and goosing their favorite pets. That's all. I think that's everything that I have to say about this.